Hey guys, welcome back to Spark AR Scripting. In today's episode, we're going to be covering promises in JavaScript and how you could use new asynchronous APIs in Spark AR. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so for this episode, I've set up a simple screen effect similar to episode 2, where we discussed reactive programming. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing on these warnings you see here in the console about materials.getAll and these other APIs being deprecated. So basically, if you go to the Spark AR documentation, there's this page called Asynchronous API Changes, which started with version 85 onwards. You can find a link in the description, but all this is saying is basically there are certain APIs which, starting version 85, have been deprecated. So that means after 6 months since when this happened, which I think has been a few months now, any effects using these APIs will become deprecated and stop working. So if we go to materials module, down here you can see materials.get is one of them. And it's saying use FindUsingPattern instead. FindUsingPattern family of methods. So if we do go to the materials module documentation, you can see over here that FindUsingPattern basically returns a promise that is resolved with all of the materials matching the name of the pattern. And in our case, we're just going to use FindFirst. FindUsingPattern lets you give a pattern, and you can use that to find a bunch of different materials in the scene. FindFirst, just you give it a name and it finds the first material which it finds with that name. So again, this returns a promise that is resolved with the material of requested name or null if none was found. So what exactly is a promise? Basically, so if you look over here, we basically have m.get and we pass in material 0. So what this is going to do is every time we call one of these, it's going to go inside the Spark engine, try and find that material 0 object and return it to us once it's found it. And if we do, then we do that again for the texture. So every time we try and find one of these assets, it's going to go to the engine, find the object, and come back. With a promise, you basically have an object which you can wait on. So you can put all these assets you want to find inside the promise, send that to the engine, it'll gather all these results and send back one object which you have to wait on. So instead of going back and forth to the engine multiple times, you only have to do this once. So let's actually see how this works. So basically, the syntax for a promise is you do promise.all, and then inside you have to give it a list of values. So a list or an array is basically just a collection of multiple different variables. So we can basically declare a variable called myArray, or let's just call it myList. And it's just, you give it these open and close square brackets, and that's the syntax for declaring a list. And then you can just give it a list of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this list could be a list of anything. It could be numbers, it could be strings, it could be any type of object. And then if we use our print function to print this list, basically when you go back to Spark, here you see a list of objects. And then you can use the array bracket syntax here to access parts of the list. So it starts at 0. So if we do 0 and then let's do 3. So 3 is going to be the fourth item because it starts at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So now if we save it and go back, we see 1 and 4. And you can even change these values. So if we do mylist 0 equals 7, and then we go back to Spark, now instead of 1 and 4, we'll see 7 and 4. So that's basically a list. So in the case of a promise, you basically give it a list here. Instead of numbers, you're giving it a list of objects, and then it'll send that to the engine. And after that, you can do .then and put your code in here. So basically it's going to go, so if you hover over here, it says creates a promise that is resolved with an array of results when all of the provided promises resolved or rejected with any promise. So basically we'll send it a bunch of assets we want to load. If it finds all of them, it'll resolve the promise and go into the then function, which over here says it's just a callback for the promise when it returns. And if it fails, it's going to go into the catch function. So the catch is something you can use to catch a bunch of errors. So if something in there wasn't found, it's going to come here. Or if there's any other error in the promise as well. So basically, all you have to do now is set it up so that instead of calling main directly, we just call main if the promise resolves. So we can do promise.all, and now inside here we have to give it a list. So again, it's going to be a comma separated list of objects, and first we have material 0. So what we're going to do is m.findFirst instead, and we give it the name material 0. So then we have textures.get, which is camera texture 0. And if you had like some objects in the scene, you would do the same thing, scene.root.findFirst. Like let's say we had a canvas in there, so we would resolve it like this basically. But I'm not using a canvas here, so let's just delete this. Okay, so now basically it's gonna send this list of objects to the engine as this promise, and then once it's resolved, it's gonna call the then function. And inside then, what we want to do is just call our main function instead. So now, instead of calling our main function on its own, we only call it if the promise was resolved. So the thing to note is, firstly, we're not going to be using this anymore, so we don't need materials.get and camera texture and textures.get. And instead of declaring these as constant, we're going to declare these as dynamic, so that we can assign them from whatever the promise returns. And over here, in the main function, we're now going to get a list of assets. So the promise is going to resolve all these assets and give us that list back. And that list is going to contain the resolved assets, which we can use in our scene. So now what we can do is basically just assign material 0 equals asset 0. So you get these back in the same order as what you put it in. So the first is going to be materials, then it's going to be camera texture 0. And then you can do camera texture equals assets 1. And since in this case, since we're only using them in this function, we actually don't need to declare them here. You can, but it's better to just declare variables. It's better to just declare variables if you need them. So in this case, we can delete these two. If we save it and go back to Spark, and there's still a warning. Textures, oh sorry, so this needs to be FindFirst. And now if we save it and go back to Spark, there you go. So now it's basically loading these using the promise, and we don't see any warnings here. So we can actually submit this effect and it won't get deprecated in 6 months. So now the thing to note is basically our main function is only going to get called once the promises have resolved. So if you put a bunch of prints here, so like I had mentioned in the previous episode, JavaScript's gonna parse your script from top to bottom. So it's going to go line by line, but it's not going to call the main function until it resolves the assets and then it comes back from the engine. So if you put a bunch of prints here, you can do print over here, starting promise. And then inside here, we can do entering main. And then over here, we can do script loaded. So, and then here we can just do starting script. So what we should see here, once we save it, it's gonna start the script, then it's gonna start the promise, then it's gonna go script loaded because this promise wouldn't have come back by that time. So now what's gonna happen is it's gonna go here, do starting script, then it's gonna come here and do starting promise, then it's gonna run the promise, and the promises are resolved asynchronously. So while it's resolving the promise, your code can do other things. So what we'll see here is script loaded. So we're going to see script loaded, and then once the promise is resolved, it's going to go inside the main function, and then we'll see entering main finally. So now if I save it, yeah, so there you go. So we see starting script, which is here. Then we see starting promise, which is here. Then it's going to go inside the promise, but it hasn't resolved yet, so it's going to come back and print script loaded because this is it's probably still in the engine. Then finally it's going to come back and say entering main. So that's basically how it works. And the advantage, of course, is it's resolving all of your assets at once. It doesn't have to go back and forth to the engine, and as you have more and more assets, this becomes much faster. to do because you want to try and minimize the number of round trips you want to do between the script and the engine. So now what we have to note is what happens if we, let's say we typed material 1 instead of material 0. We don't actually have a material 0. So as you can see, our script is white, but we didn't see any errors. So what's going to happen, and you still see the entering main over here. So it actually went inside our main function. But what's happening is if we go and print our assets, so if you do print assets, and then you hit save, you'll see the first one is null and the second one is an object. So what happened is the promise resolved, but the first asset was null, so our script basically doesn't work. And just to show you, if I do 0, we see 2 objects here. So basically in the case where we do want, when we do have errors, we have to use this thing called the catch function. And that's basically you just do catch, and then you can call another function in there. And in our case, we just want to print the errors. So all we're going to do is in the catch function, we'll print out the error message to the screen, to the console. So what I'll show you now is the Lambda syntax, which shows up a lot in JavaScript, and it's basically just a way to, instead of defining a function like this, you can just define it inside here. And all you have to do is you give it the argument it's going to expect, which is, in this case, it's going to be the error. And then you do equal arrow. So you give it this equal arrow syntax. And then here it's just declaring a function like you did over here. So instead of the word function main assets, you basically just define it inline and you have the argument here. So here, so it's basically the same as doing this function handle errors. So function error handler, and then you give it the error, and then this. So basically, instead of this, you can just do error handler instead. So instead of that, this is just the Lambda syntax, and it's basically the same thing, and it's just a way to declare the function inline. And it's pretty common, so I thought I'd just show you the syntax because it looks a bit confusing. So I tend to not use these, and I just would declare an error handler and call that instead. But so yeah, and here we can do print found errors in script, and then we can print error dot message, and that's going to print the actual message. So now if you go back to Spark and you go down here, you can see cannot read property set texture slot of null. So basically we passed the null material set texture slot, and that was the error in the script. So basically here. So now if we set it back, we don't see any errors. And the other thing you can do is, so the promise basically returns an object. So we can actually do is const load assets equals this. And what we can do instead of this inline syntax is load assets dot catch. So basically if you just want to load the promise and then do something else and then put a catch handler here, you can just do that as well. It's all the same thing, it's just different ways of declaring this syntax. So it's whatever you prefer, honestly. And if you go back, it's again the same thing. So let's get rid of our print here. And the thing to note is, even if you have errors inside the main function, it's going to be handled. So let's say if we had a typo here and we did material 1, and now we're trying to use material 0, which doesn't exist, then it's, again, if you go back, it's going to go into the error handler. So here it says material 0 doesn't exist. So make sure you do have an error handler, because once you start using promises, all your errors are going to be handled in this thing instead. So if you don't have one, like if we just delete this and go back to Spark, then we don't see any errors. It just goes into main and then no one handles the error from there. So that's just something to be aware of once you start using promises. Okay, so let's set this back to 0, and yeah, now our script works. So that's it for loading assets. The other area where this comes up is basically in the patches module. So basically earlier, if you wanted to send data from patches to script and vice versa, you would just use these set value functions. So like to set an input, you would do set pulse value, or to set an output, you would do get pulse value. or scalar value or whatever it is. Now instead you have to use inputs.setPulse and outputs.get instead. So basically these use promises as well. So if you go to the patches module documentation here, you can see there's this inputs and outputs objects, which basically gives you a list of inputs and a list of outputs. So it's the same concept basically. If you have a bunch of inputs, you resolve them all at once, and if you have a bunch of outputs, you send them all at once. So instead of doing it one by one, again, you're doing it in one go. So overall, this makes the script loading much faster. So okay, so let's just declare a few patch variables. So if you go to our script here, and here, let's say we want to send a few, let's just send a few numbers. So let's call it patchvar1, and then we can do another number, which is patchvar2. And then we can basically set these to something in our patch editor. So this one can be 1, and this one can be 7. So now, basically, instead of just calling patches.get scalar value, we're gonna have to do, so first we're gonna need the patches module. So we do const patches equals require patches. And earlier you would just be able to do patchvar1 equals patches.get scalar value. So that, and then you give it the name, which was patchvar1. And then similarly for 2, you would give it this. But if we do this here, now you'll see we have this deprecated message again. So instead of this, basically we just do patches.outputs.getScalar, and then we give it patchvar1, and then we give it patches.outputs.getScalar patchvar2. So now it's basically going to resolve our patch outputs along with the assets. So it'll do all of this in one go, and then that will just become part of the assets list. So assets 2 is going to be patchvar1, and assets 3 is going to be patchvar2. So now if we go back to Spark, here you go. So basically we've sent these across to the script and there's no errors. So let's say, so these are signals, so we can't actually print the value of them. But what we can do is actually use them. So let's just create like a modulation color. And we can do r.pack4, and we can give it patchvar1, 0, patchvar2, so, and then 1 here. So it's going to use these to create a color, and it's going to be 1071, which it's just going to be 1 and 1 because the 7 will get clamped to 1, but just to show. And then what we can do is just basically just multiply this by the modulation color, which is coming from the patch. So now we're effectively just getting rid of the green channel. So it'll multiply it by red and blue, which is like a cyan. So here, magenta actually. So it's going to give us this magenta tint. So now we can basically just set these values here. So let's just say if we set it to 0, so now it's just plain red. Then if we set this also, now it's all 3 channels are gone. And if you go back here, it's blue. So basically now you can control your script from the patch using this. So if you just add like a time, if you do runtime, and then put a sine wave here. So now that's going from -1 to 1. And then if you do set a cosine wave to this guy. So basically we get this color modulation thing. So these colors are going negative, so I usually add absolutes here. So do this, and send the absolute instead. Oh, I guess you need a different absolute. for each one of them. I don't really use patches, so I don't know all this stuff. There you go. So now we're controlling our script from the patches basically, and we just send these values across to the script. And you can do the same thing on the other side. You just do from script, and then you do, instead of that, you would do, instead of this, you would do patches dot inputs dot set scalar, and you can give it a name, and you give it whatever value you want. So it's the same thing. So there you go. We basically use promises to control our script from the patches now, which is useful if you're trying to do a hybrid approach between patches and scripting. Okay, so just to show you one more thing, there's another way to do this promise syntax, and that's using async and await functions, which have shown up in in Spark now in the latest version, I think version 90. So basically, it's the same as this, but instead of using this promise syntax, you can do it directly inside of your functions. So in order to do that, you have to basically mark your function as async. So you do async function, my function, and then inside here, let's say you want to do material 0, you would basically just do await m.findFirst material 0. So now, basically, instead of going through this promise syntax, you just have it in your function right here. But in the case of assets, it's not really useful because, again, this will effectively do it the same way as it was earlier, where you're waiting for each of these one by one. But if you're just doing a one-off promise, then it might be easier to use this syntax instead. And you can look up async and await functions in JavaScript if you're interested in more about this. But for most purposes, when you're just loading assets and stuff, then this stuff is fine, and it's just, in the syntax really not that bad. You just do promise.all and you give it a list of objects, and then it's resolved and you handle the errors here. Alright, so that's it for now. I hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and try practicing this out and experimenting with moving your bold effects to promises and see how that goes. And yeah, let me know if there's any questions and I'll get back to you. Alright, so I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys next time.